So, balance. I am like the least appropriate person to be talking to you about balance. Marge nodding. Yes, my life is often out of balance. And it starts with ministry. I mean, ministry is a profession to which you have to give your whole heart, right? But one of the things that we talk about when we talk about balance a lot in our lives is balance of work and family. And because they're both, especially if you're in a profession where you give your whole heart, they're both things to which you want to give your whole heart, right? But you only have so much energy to go around. And we are particularly brutal, I think, with women in this society about finding that balance between work and family. That we shame them, no matter which they choose. If they choose work and they're putting their kids in daycare, we shame them for not being the stay-at-home mom. If they're the stay-at-home mom, we shame them for not working. And we don't make it easy for them to not work. So this is a balance that our society has not found, and that we as women, and particularly working women and working mothers, we struggle, I think, all of us, with that balance between work and family. But we're not the only ones who struggle with it. Men struggle with it too, work and family. Transgender people struggle with it too. Work and family, or work and love, work and enjoyment, work and savoring the world. That's something that as a society we're out of balance in, because we basically, although we worked with our unions back in the 20s and 30s, we fought for the 40-hour a week, we have slipped away from it ever since. And we work more hours in our society than many other First Nations countries, because they have found, first world countries, I know, First Nations is Native Americans. That's what happens when you speak extemporaneously. So we have lost that balance compared to where a lot of other countries have found it. I found an Inc. magazine, it's a business magazine article about finding balance, and it talked about finding balance in several different realms of your life. One was work and finding your balance there, one was family, and one was spirituality, one was civic participation. And as a society, we have really decreased in our civic participation too. That's another area where we can be out of balance. I heard one of the young protesters said yesterday, or said in a quote recently, that he compared our politicians to older parents who don't know how to use their phone. And he used some swear words when he was saying this, but he was saying essentially, it's like, here, give me your phone, I'll show you how to use it. And he was saying that this is true about our democracy, that the young people are saying to us, here, give us your democracy, you don't know how to use it, right? That we allow it to go on without engaging it, because in our society, as big as it is, it's out of balance with the amount of participation from people and how the people's voices are getting heard, versus how the corporations' voices are getting heard and the lobbyists' voices are getting heard. I mean, we've talked a lot lately about the NRA's voice and how loud it is to our lobbyists, or how loud as a lobbyist it is to our politicians. But just think about something like the prison system. The prison system pushes a surprising number of dollars into our politicians. And it's easy to see how, if you're getting paid by prisons, and prisons as companies want more prisoners because that's more money for their system, then you as a politician may be less inclined to vote for prison reform measures. And so it is with any industry. I mean, I just picked one, but any industry that we can name where the politicians are being paid by lobbyists that have more money than we as people can put in. I mean, the teachers' lobby is one of the strongest lobbies on the left, but its numbers are small compared to some of these mega corporations. So just another example of how we're out of balance as a society. And you think about our Earth and how out of balance we've thrown it as a society. Like, as Earth Day approaches and World Water Day has just passed, we're in this season for climate justice in between these two dates. And it's remarkable how in America, more than half the people really don't believe in climate change. despite the overwhelming preponderance of science. And that's because we've invented this myth of balance in our discourse, where we say we have to say both sides, and that this is a debatable issue, and we're always going to talk about both sides every time we talk about it in the media. But what that both sides does is it presents a false sense of balance in discourse, which leads to an actual imbalance in our earth. So balance, different ways in which we as a society, we as a people need to seek more balance in our lives. And one of the, surprise, I'm going to say to you, one of the best ways to find balance is through spirituality. It's through bringing spirituality more into your lives. And that can mean a number of different things, but for some people it may mean journaling, it may mean, especially when you're talking about that work-play balance, that family-employment balance, that savoring the world or saving it balance, it means taking time, reflecting. And that's the essence of what spiritual practice is. Every spiritual practice method is a reflection method. It's a way of going into yourself, looking at that imbalance, making steps or plans, and then living that out, and then coming back into reflection again to see how you've done and balancing it again. One of the oldest examples of this comes from the Buddha. So the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, he was a prince, the legend of the Buddha tells us originally. He was a prince who lived a very secluded, sequestered life in which he had not been able to see the sufferings of the world. He didn't know poverty. He didn't know about old age. He didn't know about death. He didn't know about disease and illness, pain, hunger. And then one day, he saw those things. He went out into the world and he saw them. And what he ended up doing was leaving the life of privilege as he had known it, leaving his wife and family, and going out and living the life of an ascetic. So he fasted, and he lived harsh conditions, trying to experience the other side of things from his life of privilege. And what happened to the Buddha is that after living both of those paths, he decided that neither was the way. That ascetic life, the life of fasting and hardship, also wasn't what the spirit or the soul needed. It wasn't what he needed to become a complete person. And he found what he called the middle path. So the middle path in Buddhism, you follow the middle path through knowing the Four Noble Truths and following the Eightfold Path, which is represented by this wheel with 8 spokes. That's the Eightfold Path. And what the Eightfold Path is not about living an ascetic life. It's not about throwing yourself away from the world, locking yourself away from the world, and never engaging with it. Some people think that that's what spirituality means. It means you have to be cloistered in a monastery. You have to become a monk. But the middle path is about thinking it through, thinking about right speech, right action, right thought, right, there's 8 of them. Right livelihood? Maybe. Yeah, you can Google it. So you follow these 8 principles, like our 7 principles, and they teach you steps towards finding this balance, finding the balance in your life between these 2 extremes. That's what Buddhism, that's at the heart of Buddhism. It's not always be in meditation all the time. Meditation is used as this tool towards finding that sense of balance in your lives. And so I want to think about what we can take from that in a Unitarian Universalist context. Most of us aren't going to become Buddhists, but we are spiritual people, as however we define that. And you may say, I'm not spiritual. Okay. If you're not, then think about this in a secular context, how you practice reflection upon your life, setting steps out for yourself, principles out for yourself. How can you use our 7 principles to guide your life and reflect back upon them in an action reflection method. Martin Luther King also talked about an action reflection method to his work of nonviolence, that you go out and do the work of nonviolence, but then you come back and you reflect on it. You plan for it, you do the action, you come back. It's a circular system, always. And that's what every religion kind of teaches us. Christianity less so, because Jesus wasn't always about a middle path. Sometimes he was quite radical. But we'll talk about that next week on Easter. So, action reflection, action reflection. Our 7 principles can form a basis for that reflection model. So you can come back and say, how is whatever I'm struggling with finding balance in, how does it live these principles? How can I bring it more into alignment with my faith? But you don't have to use those. You could use a poem or a sacred scripture for yourself, or your own writings to set forward, these are my goals, and then reflect back on how you're achieving them. It's really that simple. I say spiritual practice is often about things that, it sounds very lofty, sometimes spiritual practice, and people think, oh no, I'm not that. But if you break it down into, this is about listening, or this is about music, this is about silence, this is about thinking things through one step at a time. Those are things we all know how to do. So, let me check my notes here. Savoring the world or saving it. That's what I wanted to come back to. Savoring the world or saving it. How many of you were at protests yesterday? 4, 5. How many of you were not? Yeah, I wasn't either. And sometimes that's the choice we make, and maybe you're disappointed in me because you thought I'd be out there. But I made the choice yesterday, since I hadn't really had a day with family on a Saturday in quite a while, that I was going to just do some family time. And we went to the Concatenation conference that John Hart organized down at JC, and we listened to lectures and played board games and heard some music and that sort of thing. So how then do I find balance if I didn't do that with what was going on yesterday? That was the largest protest maybe in D.C. ever. Elizabeth Walker was telling me that she just Googled it and it was 800,000 people in D.C. And like the Women's March, we had marches all over the country in concert with that. In Michigan, we had not just Detroit, and not just Lansing, and not just Ann Arbor, but also a small march in Adrian? Amazing. I mean, 800,000 people on the mall is amazing. 50 or 100 people in Adrian is amazing, right?
It's like Friday Starkville.
And, for those students, I think to them, I hope someone is talking to them about balance, because they are throwing their heart and soul, these Parkland students, into helping us find balance as a society, but I hope they're finding balance as individuals. Time to grieve, time to mourn, time for the sadness, time for their studies, time for their families, time to step away from it all, because being thrust into the media spotlight at such a young age is not an easy process. But for us, finding balance between savoring the world and saving it is something that we need to do. So if we didn't march, how do we find the time to connect to the path of justice? How do we connect to that we can write our senators and our congressmen, whether or not they'll listen, right? We can go to the next march. We can raise our voices on social media. We can give money to a campaign. There are lots of other methods you can use to connect to activism. I was watching a short little documentary about protests. A lot of people say, well, protests are ineffective. And many of the protests in the last decade have been. And that's sometimes because it just sparks real fast on social media. Like somebody puts out a Facebook page and all of a sudden they've got 100 people showing up to DC. That's how the Women's March started. And then nothing much has come of that, right? Because it wasn't built into a system of, no? You say no, things have come of it, we just don't know about it.
How many women have run now for office?
Right. Yeah, I feel like nothing's come of it just perhaps because we still have Trump in office. But you're right. No, women have run for office, and these are just steps in a larger campaign. So to think that protest itself has to lead to everything, that, okay, we're going to protest and the next day laws are going to be changed, politicians are going to be out who we're in, is misguided. Protests take time, they take building, they take one step at the next. To run women for office is a process that takes time to change our society. The Me Too movement started with just a hashtag, and it's led to several powerful people being ousted from positions, and yet many of them still are in. And so it's a process. And we have to find our balance with how much we can engage in it. And particularly, I found that at the beginning of the Trump era, that I wanted to be doing something every day to combat the things that were flying so fast and furious from his office about how it was changing our world in ways that I didn't agree with. But I burned out on that real fast because I hadn't found that balance between savoring the world and saving it. I don't have the magic answer for how you do that, except to go back into that spiritual practice to reflect. If I want to do one more step, write it down, come back to it, make sure that I'm taking small baby steps towards it, one thing at a time. That's the only way we ever make change, is one thing at a time. One of my sacred texts that speaks to me about balance, speaks to me about balance in the world of nature, and it speaks to me about balance in my soul between despair and hope, is Wendell Berry's The Peace of Wild Things. I'm going to conclude with his words. When despair grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the wild water and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water. And I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting for their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world, and I'm free. So do take the time to rest by the still water, to feed your soul, to feed your spirit. But let it nourish you so that you can go back out into the world, live your religion, and save the world again, one piece at a time. I think of balance as a dance. So we're going to sing Let It Be a Dance We Do. Number 311, rise in body or in spirit.